Hello, in this lesson we're going to be talking about configuring kubectl for remote access. So we're going to be setting up our local kubectl installation to be able to communicate with our remote Kubernetes cluster using our load balancer. Now, the problem is these cloud servers are always changing their IPs, and also they don't allow access to the port 6443, which we use for our Kubernetes API server. So we're going to have to do a little bit of a workaround to get around that. And the way that we're going to get around that for this lesson is we're going to set up an SSH tunnel. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and set up that SSH tunnel. And I'm just going to copy the public IP of my load balancer, which is, for me, cloud server number 6. I'm going to copy that public IP. And I'm going to go over here to a shell. And I'm going to set up that SSH tunnel with the SSH command. So I'm going to do an SSH-L for listen, and I'm going to forward port 6443 from my localhost box on port 6443. So what that's going to do is it's going to listen on my box on port 6443, and it's going to tunnel traffic to that port over this SSH connection to port 6443 on the remote server, which in this case is my load balancer. So that's how I'm going to get around that limitation. And of course, I need to provide my credentials and what server I want to log into. So I'm going to do user at, and then I'll paste in that public IP address from my load balancer server. And now that I've entered my credentials, you can see it just logged me in normally with a normal SSH session. As long as I keep this open, it's going to continue to do that port forwarding and maintain that SSH tunnel. So I'm just going to leave this shell open, and I'm going to go to another shell to go ahead and start doing the actual steps that I need to do for this learning activity. So I'm on my local machine, and I'm going to change directory into ~/kthw, and this is just the directory that I used early on in the course to generate all these files, my kubeconfig files and my certificate files. And the reason I've gone into this directory is because I'm going to need some of these files for some of the commands that I'm about to run. I'm going to need my certificate authority, ca.pem, as well as my admin.pem certificate and my adminkey.pem key for that certificate. So I'm going to need those 3 files. And now I'm ready to start configuring my local kubectl installation. So I'm going to paste in this command. Of course, you can find all these commands below this video if you want to follow along. And I'm doing a kubectl config set cluster. What I'm doing is I'm setting up a new Kubernetes cluster in the local configuration for kubectl. And I'm going to call that cluster Kubernetes the hard way. And I need to pass in my certificate authority. And I'm also specifying embed certs equals true. So what that's going to do is it's going to take these certificate files and it's going to actually embed the data from those files into my kubeconfig so that I don't always need to have these files in place. They'll just be right there embedded in the kubeconfig. And then I'm specifying my server, which in this case is localhost 6443. And that's going to work because of that SSH tunnel that we just set up. So when it hits localhost 6443, that traffic is going to be forwarded to the load balancer server through that SSH tunnel. Now I'm ready to set up my credentials. So I'm going to run this kubectl config set credentials command, and I'm passing in the name of the user that I want to set credentials for, which is admin. And then my credentials are my actual admin.pem certificate file and the key, adminkey.pem. So those are my credentials, those 2 files. So I'm going to go ahead and run that command. And now I need to set up a context. So I'm going to use a kubectl config set context. Kubectl supports this concept of contexts, and a context is just a set of data that I'm going to use in order to connect to a server, and I can configure multiple contexts. And the main use case for that is if you have multiple Kubernetes clusters that you're managing, you can switch contexts in order to switch between those servers. We're only managing one right now, but we still need to set up a context in order to represent that configuration. So I'm setting up a context called Kubernetes the hard way, and it's going to reference a cluster by that same name, which is Kubernetes the hard way, and that's the cluster name that we provided in the first command. And I'm also telling it what user to use to authenticate with that cluster. That's the admin user that we set up in this command right here. So now that I've set up my context, there's one more command I need to run, and that's the kubectl config use context. And I'm just telling kubectl that right now I want to use this Kubernetes the hard way context so that any commands that I enter, if I do a kubectl get pods, for example, it will use that context and it's going to connect to that Kubernetes cluster, and that's the cluster I'm going to get pod information from. So I'll go ahead and run that command, and now my local kubectl is configured, and I'm ready to test it out and make sure it's working. So let's just do a kubectl get pods, and this should return pod information for my remote cluster. Right now, there's no pods, so it's not going to list any pods, but it should return no resources found to indicate that there's actually no pods running in the cluster. And sure enough, I got no resources found, which indicates that I am actually successfully communicating with my cluster. I'm also going to do a kubectl get nodes, just so we can see there's my 2 worker nodes from my cluster. And I can do a kubectl version, just to get the version information. Of course, here's the client version, but here's the server information that I know is coming from my remote cluster. So it looks like everything's working. I've successfully set up my local kubectl to be able to communicate with my remote cluster.